Today we are walking through the paper titled The Spike, the Sparse and the Sync Anatomy of Massive Activations Under Tension Syncs.
Give me the big picture first.
At the highest level, this paper asks why do famous transformer oddities, massive activations under tension syncs, keep showing up together. The authors argue that the overlap is usually not a deep law of language modeling. It is mostly a side effect of the default pre-norm transformer recipe.
So what role does each phenomenon play once the paper separates them?
The paper gives them different jobs. Massive activations are extreme values in a few channels for a few tokens, so the authors call those spike tokens and spike channels. Attention sinks are tokens that receive abnormal attention mass. Spikes act globally by planting persistent features in the residual stream, while sinks act locally by steering individual heads towards short-range routing.
What gap in earlier work is the paper trying to close?
Earlier work mostly described the co-occurrence and noted that the same first token or delimiter token often participates in both. What was missing was a causal explanation. Which architectural choice makes them appear together? What each phenomenon actually does? And whether we can remove one without destroying the other.
What does the paper actually do to answer that?
This paper answers with a concrete chain. One or two early feed-forward blocks create the outlier channels. The prenorm residual path lets those outliers survive through many later blocks. RMS norm then turns the resulting spike token representations into sparse, near-constant vectors. In some heads, that geometry makes sync keys sit closer to ordinary queries than normal keys do, so a sync forms. To see why prenorm matters, let me put their unrolled layer update on the board.
For equation 14, what should I read first?
This equation says the hidden state at depth at +1 is the original representation plus the sum of all normalized block outputs up to that point. That matters because once an early block injects a huge spike, later layers do not override it by default. They keep carrying it forward until a late step-down block cancels it. That is why the paper treats spikes as persistent, almost parameter-like features inside one forward pass. Here is the first core visual, the depth trace for Llama to 7b.
What is the most important pattern to notice in this trace?
The top panel stays high for most of the network, while the bottom panel shows the actual injections only at a couple of early blocks and then the cancellation near the end. So the extreme activation is not being recreated everywhere. It is created early, carried by the residual stream, and only later removed. The second panel repeats the same analysis for Q138B.
Does that make the story more than just one model-specific work?
Yes, the same step-up then step-down pattern appears in Q138B even though the exact block indices change. That matters because the paper is not leaning on one quick checkpoint. It argues that intermediate layer spikes are a structural pattern across model families. Next is the CLU plot for the step-up and step-down feed-forward blocks.
Why is that new identity behavior important for the mechanism?
For the red spike token points, cosine similarity stays near 1 and the norm ratio stays close to 1 as well. In plain language, the gate is not rotating the representation into something new. It is mostly preserving direction while the surrounding quadratic structure amplifies selected channels. That is why the authors call the feed-forward block a directional quadratic amplifier. Now look at the quadratic form norm plot.
What is the concrete comparison here between spike and non-spike channels?
Most channels sit in a narrow low band, but spike channels like 1415 and 2533 jump far above the rest, and they do so in the early step-up block and late step-down block. The comparison is important. Non-spike channels do not get those giant norms, so the paper is not claiming every feed-forward dimension is unstable. It claims a small set of channels has unusually high gain exactly where spikes are created under race. The eigenvalue spectrum makes that gain story even sharper.
What does that dominant eigenvalue add to the story?
For spike channels, one eigenvalue dominates the whole spectrum, while non-spike channels do not show that outlier. That means the block strongly amplifies movement along one preferred direction. A token becomes a spike token when its representation aligns with that direction, so the mechanism is selective rather than random. Now we reach the bridge from spikes to syncs.
How does the cosine similarity plot connect the spike story to the sync story?
Before the step-up block, spike token representations still differ. After the step-up block, their cosine similarities collapse toward 1, so very different tokens start pointing in almost the same direction. Combined with normalization, that makes the representation sparse, bounded, and near constant. That is the paper's bridge. Spikes create the raw outlier, and normalization converts it into the kind of vector that can act like a sync.
What is the strongest evidence that syncs are not simply the same thing as spikes?
The ablations are strongest there. Changing the normalization setup can suppress massive activations while preserving attention syncs, which breaks the idea that one automatically causes the other. The paper also finds that sync strength depends strongly on attention space dimensionality. At fixed total capacity, fewer larger heads intensify sync behavior and improve perplexity. And when the authors add conditional gated attention, sync ratio drops sharply and spikes disappear with little cost in language modeling quality.
What is the practical takeaway if someone cares about inference or model design?
The practical message is that these are design artifacts we can manipulate. If you want better quantization or more stable inference, you can target spikes without necessarily destroying the local routing behavior syncs seem to provide. And if you want to reduce sync behavior for long context use, the paper suggests changing head capacity, gating, or the training context length distribution instead of treating syncs as unavoidable.
What is the clearest final takeaway at the end?
So the paper's main contribution is not a new language model architecture. It is a mechanistic map. Early feed-forward blocks create spikes. Pre-norm residual accumulation preserves them. Normalization turns them into sparse near constant vectors. And geometrical alignment in some heads turns those vectors into syncs. Once that chain is explicit.
That makes the relationship much clearer. The overlap is common, but it is not fundamental.
That wraps up this paper, VOICEVOX.